presentation of the death of Alexei Navalny in the Westminster Parliament is very interesting, and I'm going to play as much of it as I can. I don't want to overwhelm my channel with bits of Parliament played willy-nilly, but there are various things which I think are of interest. The first one, which I find quite fascinating, is Leo Doherty is clearly reading from notes that have been prepared by bureaucrats, and the way you can tell is that he uses an expression which has become bureaucratically obligatory, and it's wrong in this regard, and again and again and again this expression is used. When he goes off script, he talks about with regard to, which is the correct English expression anyway. One of his defences for not breaking diplomatic relations with Russia is that he still seeks consular access, but you have to wait. You have to wait until is it Bob Seeley, I think, who talks about trying to trade Vladimir Kara Murza for prisoners, maybe in Sweden or somewhere. And then there's this there's the little interjection by Neil Hanvey, who says, well, you know, is our own backyard clean, and what are we going to do about Assange? And Doherty turns around and says, well, you can hear from the tone in the House that there is no equivalence between political prisoners in Moscow and Assange. I think at some point we need to have a look at the Assange situation, because it's not good that he remains in prison simply for contempt of court, and his health is also failing, and Stephen Kinnock is, of course, as ever, always listenable to, and he has experience of Russia, having worked in St. Petersburg. Tobias Ellwood rather brilliantly points out that Mr. Putin is trying to emulate Stalin, and Rees-Mogg, like Tobias Ellwood, calls for breaking diplomatic links with Russia. Rees-Mogg has nothing further to say. Rees-Mogg has become a rather pointless member of the House of Commons. But I think it is telling that although there is determination to do something, it's not clear what Britain can do. I think there's a recognition that sanctions are a bit of a waste of time, no matter how much people insist on them. And indeed, Doherty recognises that they are not as effective as they could be, but they do have some effect. There was a talk about America putting more oil into the market, and so driving down the cost of oil, driving down the price of oil, and therefore more seriously impacting Russia's ability to raise money against the oil that it sells. But I think sanctions effectively only hurt ourselves, in the same way breaking diplomatic relations with another country only hurts ourselves, and hurts the people diplomats represent, British people abroad, people with a British passport abroad, who can turn to us for help. But I'm afraid at the moment I don't think they're getting very much help. Saying we are seeking diplomatic access is not quite enough. We're getting diplomatic access. That's what we expect. That's what we
responsible for facilitating and enabling international corruption. Little or no action on breaches of new Russian sanctions brought in since the full-scale invasion of Ukraine has happened. So will he not strengthen not just our sanctions regime, but how those sanctions are enforced? Will he support calls to establish an international anti-corruption court? And will he turn rhetoric on frozen Russian state assets into tangible action? When will the government get on with it? It's a source of shame, Madam Deputy Speaker, that under successive Tory governments, Britain became the money laundering capital of the world. And our tributes to Alexei Navalny must be more than just rhetorical and include tangible action at home to clean up the financial crime fueling autocrats abroad. Finally, Madam Deputy Speaker, I want to ask the Minister about Vladimir Kara Murza. I've met his brave wife and mother personally and heard directly from them. Vladimir is another brave and vocal opponent of Putin, languishing in prison for his beliefs. He's also a British citizen. We know what Putin is capable of. So can I ask the Minister what the FCDO's current assessment of his welfare is and what steps are being taken to support him and his family? The tragic death of Alexei Navalny has reverberated across the world. It must serve as a reminder of Putin's menace and underscore our responsibility to oppose him in Ukraine, on the world stage, and indeed here in London. And I hope that the Minister can provide the House with some assurance that today's statement will be accompanied with commensurate, bold and urgent action.
Well, Madam Deputy Speaker, we will act, but can I say, firstly, can I express my thanks to the honourable gentleman for the tone of his response, and I join him in endorsing everything he said about the heroically brave Mrs. Navalny. Those in this House who watched her video earlier this morning will have been extremely moved by her fortitude and courage in this extremely difficult time. And he used the word courage with regard to Mr. Navalny, which was absolutely appropriate. Those of us who watched the footage of Mr. Navalny returning to Russia subsequent to the Novichok attack were humbled by his audacity and his bravery. And his hope for a free and happy Russia is something that we must ensure that can remain in the hearts of the many Russians who, despite the extraordinary levels of press censorship and repression, deserve to have that promise, the opportunity to live up to that promise. It would be premature, Madam Deputy, if we comment on the prospect of future sanctions, in addition to the sanctions that have already been put in place with regard to his poisoning. But I can assure the honourable gentleman and the House that we are working at pace and looking at all options in that regard. Of course, we will continue our very active diplomatic work to crack down on networks of corruption surrounding the Russian state and its kleptocracy. And as a part of that, sanctions evasion is a particularly important component and something our diplomatic teams around the world in concert with our allies are very much focused on. He asked a relevant question about seizing versus freezing assets. We continue to work with G7 allies and to look at all legal routes to ensuring that assets that are frozen might be used to help the reconstruction effort by those who deserve them, and we will keep the House updated as and when we make progress on that. But we do seek to act in this regard, and that is how we can honour Mr. Navalny's memory and his legacy, by acting, not just making rhetorical statements. He asked about Mr. Vladimir Kara Murza. Through our ambassador in Moscow, we continue to make representations inquiring after his health and well-being and seeking consular access to him. And I can confirm that the Foreign Secretary remains in contact with Mrs. Kara Murza and continues to support the family.
Chair of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee, Alicia Cairns.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Alexei Navalny was murdered, and it is important that we in this House call it out for what it was, because that is what he deserves. Following his murder, I was also in Munich, where I heard his wife, Yulia, ask for us to stand by her. That is what we must now do. The US threatened over a year ago that there would be significant repercussions if Navalny was murdered. Biden must now deliver on that threat, or we will see more lives taken, such as that of Vladimir Kara Murza. In addition, will my right honourable friend and I reiterate the calls for the seizing of central bank assets? I would make the point that that was done before the UN Security Council froze and seized Iraqi assets. So we have a precedent. There is no reason for us to find new legislation or other ways to do so. But beyond that, we do need to pursue a special tribunal on the crime of aggression. Will we consider also sanctioning Russia's deposit insurance agency? And finally, to hit the heart of Putin's economy, will we urge the US to release more oil and therefore drive down prices?
Well, Madam Speaker, I'm very grateful to the Honourable lady who speaks with authority, and I'm grateful for her reflections on her meeting in Munich. She's right to use the word murder. We do seek to hold the state and the Russian leadership to account. Of course, I can't comment on the American position, but with regard to our policy with regard to Russian state assets, we will continue to look at the appropriate legal path to ensuring that that which is frozen might be utilised to bring benefit to those affected by this outrageous and illegal war in Ukraine. In terms of accountability, a special tribunal is one of the things that we are considering, together with our Ukrainian allies and Sir Howard Morrison, and there's been a large degree of institutional work together with Ukrainians and the G7 group in regard to that. So we will continue to find the best mechanism possible that might sit alongside the ICC, which has already, of course, indicted Putin, and that indictment for crimes with relation to trafficking children did have an impact on his travel plans. So it does. Sometimes the cogs of justice can turn slowly, but they do turn surely. She mentioned a good point about the insurance agency. I can't comment on that now. And she also asked about the flows of oil, which, again, I can't make any comment, but we are focused in a laser-like way on the economic impact of our sanctions in the round. And I should say that this House should have confidence that when you take our actions as part of the G7 response, the economic impact and the extent to which G7 and international actions in terms of sanctions, the way that they have impact the ability for Putin to fund his war, have been very, very significant to the tune of billions.
SNP spokesperson Alan Smith.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. We are all of us appalled at this murder and the timing of it. It was designed to send a message and it needs a serious response. And I'm grateful for sight of the statement as far as it goes, and I think the Minister would acknowledge that it doesn't go very far. So I would press for further action. The Minister will be aware that the EU Foreign Affairs Council is meeting in Brussels as we speak, and they're looking at a range of measures as well. So can the Minister assure us that the UK will be part of those efforts? Particularly with regard to the implementation of Magnitsky sanctions. I'm not looking for an announcement now, but making sure that we are coordinated with that. Also, I'd reiterate my own calls for the sequestration of the Russian assets that have been seized. This death, this murder, was designed to send a message. A serious message must be the response to it, and if there is one, it'll have SNP support. Thank you.
I'm grateful as ever to the SNP spokesperson for his tone and his support. Of course, it would be premature for me to comment on and we never comment by convention on sanctions from the dispatch box, but of course we are looking at pace at all options in response to this outrageous event. And of course, in that context, we will continue to liaise with US and EU allies. That's a matter of course. He asked a good question about sequestration. Again, I can't comment other than to say that we continue to look at the most viable legal route to bring about that good.
Sir Jacob Rees-Mogg.
Madam Deputy Speaker, could my honourable friend tell the House what advantages remain in maintaining diplomatic relations with this murderous and barbarous regime?
The benefit, Madam Deputy Speaker, is in order to deliver messages of condemnation and outrage, and to continue to advocate for consular access to those held by the Russian regime.
Dame Margaret Hodge.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I want to turn to the economic impact of the sanctions, which the Minister alluded to. A loophole in our sanctions regime means that countries like China and India import Russian crude oil, process it, and then sell it into the UK as refined oil. In 2023, we imported 5.2 million barrels of this oil, and that means that we sent something like £141 million in tax revenue into Kremlin's war chest. Britain is also the biggest insurer of Russian oil moved by sea, most of which is sold at prices well above the price cap, again violating sanctions. Does the Minister agree that tough words are no substitute for tough actions, especially after the shocking murder of the heroic Alexei Navalny. Will he agree to report back to Parliament before Easter with proposals to stop this sanctions busting?
Madam Deputy Speaker, we should have confidence that the economic impact of sanctions has been very significant. Putin has been denied hundreds of billions of dollars because of the collective action of G7 nations. Is it perfect? No, it's not. Are we looking at ways of making it more effective? Yes, we are. And will we keep the House updated? Of course.
Tobias Ellwood.
Speech at the Munich Security Conference changed the tone of that entire summit. She called for the West to act. Would the Minister agree with me that Navalny's death underlines Putin's determination to emulate Stalin, to quash free voice of speech in Russia, but also to extend Russia's influence beyond its own borders? Could I ask whether when we speak of sanctions, we might also consider pressing the Americans to expedite that $60 billion that Ukraine needs? Because one way we can honor Navalny's life is by making sure Ukraine wins and Russia loses. And to that extent, could I also suggest that while diplomatic back channels need to remain open, maybe it's time to dismiss the Russian ambassador?
Madam Deputy Speaker, we will continue to lead by example in terms of our provision of lethal aid and humanitarian aid, and of course we hope and expect that our closest allies will do the same. The impact of our provision has been very, very significant. He made a very good point about Putin's leadership. I think what this event shows actually is the fact that Putin is fearful of those who have the courage, like Mr. Navalny, to challenge him and speak truth to power, because that's the most potent action in the face of a cruel, repressive, tyrannical regime like Mr. Putin's, which ultimately is quite brittle.
Richard Ford.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. At the end of February last year, Alexei Navalny clarified his position on Crimea. He talked about how the borders of Ukraine and of Russia were internationally recognised and were defined in 1991. Does the Minister agree that, while it's not our position or our place to choose the government of Russia, we do long for a time when Russia is governed by a government that respects sovereignty and territorial integrity?
Honourable gentleman, and there is no inevitability about the Russian people being ruled by a tyrannical tyrant, a latter-day Tsar. There's no inevitability about that. And then Mr. Navalny knew that, and that's why his messages and his brilliantly produced and humorous videos were watched by millions of people in Russia, because many millions of Russian people seek that alternative.
Henry Smith.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. It is clear that domestically the Putin regime is a criminal racket, and of course internationally has brought war against Ukraine and threatens many others. What discussions and diplomatic efforts is the UK government making with other NATO members who don't pay the minimum 2% GDP towards our common defence?
Very good question, and we continue to make that point in a very full-throated way to our NATO allies, which is, as you know, a growing organisation with a growing potency and capability, but we collectively must and will put our money where our mouth is.
Stephen Kinnock.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. I declare an interest. I was director of the British Council in St. Petersburg from 2005 to 2008, and also I'm honoured to call Vladimir Kara Murza my friend. I met him shortly before he insisted on flying back to Russia, and in spite of many of us urging him not to do that, it's a measure of the man that he did that, and indeed we're talking about somebody who the Russian authorities have tried to poison twice. So similar to the heroism of Navalny, Kara Murza has stood up against the mafia state that is represented by Vladimir Putin. The question I'd like to ask the Minister is, he has said, and it was good to hear that our ambassador in Moscow is doing his best to get access to Kara Murza. Could I press him on this issue around his medical condition. He is weakened by the 2 attempts at his poisoning, and we are desperately worried that he may well be on the list in terms of what the Kremlin may be wanting to do next. And his medical health is of the utmost importance. Could the Minister please say what steps are being taken specifically to ensure that Mr. Kara Murza's health is being looked after?
Grateful to the honourable gentleman, and I'm great, and he knows, and he knows from his own experience the system that we are dealing with. In direct answer to his question, we continue to make representations at the very highest level into the senior membership, the leadership of the Russian state, that we expect Mr. Kara Murza's health to be attended to, and for him to receive medical care, and for no threat to be made to his life. This message is carried by our ambassador directly to Russian government ministers. And of course, in addition to that, ministers and the Foreign Secretary continue to engage with Mrs. Kara Murza to offer their family full support.
Sir John Whittingdale.
Does my honourable friend agree that the murder of Alexander Navalny, following the murder earlier of Boris Nemtsov, shows the absolute refusal of Putin to tolerate any kind of genuine democratic opposition? Yeah. And will the government therefore give absolutely no credibility or recognition to the sham pretense that the so-called presidential election taking place next month in Russia undoubtedly will be?
Hear, hear.
Indeed, Madam Deputy Speaker, he speaks from a position of knowledge, and he's absolutely right about the forthcoming sham elections on the 12th of March. The murders of which he speaks do show a terrible pattern. But as I said previously, we should not feel that there is any inevitability about repressive government being an inevitability in Russia. The Russian people do have a hope that there can be a different government, and that's why Mr. Navalny's message was received so well.
Joanna Cherry.
Speaker, all those who care about democracy and free speech should condemn the murder of Alexander Navalny. But one of the most meaningful things the United Kingdom government could do to honour his memory is to take steps to deal effectively with the dirty Russian money being laundered in this country, particularly as it's money that's been made through nefarious means by allies of Putin. So could the government address that question? What are they going to do to deal more effectively with the dirty Russian money being laundered in the United Kingdom?
The House should have confidence and should be proud of the fact that we have sanctioned more than 1,900 individuals and entities. There is no space or place for dirty Russian money in the United Kingdom.
Rob Seeley.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I just want to reinforce the point about Vladimir Kara Murza. He's a British citizen. He's now the most high-profile political prisoner in Russia. In my conversations with the Minister and with his officials, when I've talked about prisoner swaps, which I was doing at the behest of the Navalny team, it was made quite clear that to do that encourages state hostage-taking. I accept that argument, as difficult as it is. Unfortunately, it comes at a price. In my conversations with Yevgenia Kara Murza, she is adamant that she wants everything now done, if possible, to get Vladimir out, despite the fact that he went back of his own accord, because his health is in a fragile condition, and if Putin can kill Navalny, he can kill Kara Murza. There is some criticism that the government has not done everything possible in the past. Will he reassure me that every conceivable course of action to get Kara Murza out, potentially including, negotiated swaps with, Russian spies in Sweden or wherever, every option will be looked at, because otherwise he'll be next?
Well, Madam Deputy Speaker, as the honourable gentleman said himself, we do not and would not countenance a policy of prisoner swaps. But of course, we continue to make every effort to support Mrs. Kara Murza and to seek the release of Vladimir.
Neil Hanley.
Speaker, holding political prisoners is not a sign of strength, it's a sign of weakness, and Mr. Navalny's death and murder should be rightly condemned. However, right now in the UK, journalist Julian Assange is in Belmarsh prison for blowing the whistle on atrocities in Iraq. Does the Minister agree that it is important for the UK government to measure itself against the same standards if it's going to criticise others?
Well, I think the honourable gentleman can sense that the House knows there is no equivalence.
David Jones.
Madam Deputy Speaker. In 2020, Alexei Navalny was treated in hospital in Berlin, having been poisoned in Russia by a toxin subsequently identified, as my honourable friend has said, as Novichok, which was the same toxin that was used in the attempted murder of Sergei Skripal in Salisbury in 2018. Given the use of the same toxin in such similar circumstances, does my honourable friend not agree that it is overwhelmingly likely that agents of the Russian state were responsible for the attempted murder of Navalny in 2020, that any current protestations by the Russian state that it is not responsible for his death last week are entirely risible, and what action is the government taking to ensure that those who are responsible are brought to book and tried before a court?
Well, the right honourable gentleman is correct. That's why we do demand a full and transparent investigation, because those individuals involved must be held.
Our job, I think, is to keep our eye on this stuff with Russia and surrounding Alexei Navalny. And I think we need, as a country, to find a different way, a different path than sanctions to send clear messages, because we're going to run out of messages that we can send. And I think it's more than messages we need to be sending. We need to be sending action. I strongly think that the way forward is not to break diplomatic links between Britain and Russia, but to revitalise them. And that means more meetings, more conversations, and rather than Britain wagging the finger at Russia, I think we need to open those diplomatic gates and find out what we can do together, because I strongly believe that the diplomats we are talking to are fully aware of the heinous quality of their leadership, fully aware of that. And not everybody is a shadow of Mr. Putin, and not everybody supports him. And we need to find diplomatic ways to quietly turn the screw on the Putin regime. That is what we did well in the past. That's what we can do well now. But I think instead we have adopted the Liz Truss approach of finger wagging and hand slamming, the sort of the hand movements, the hand jobs of power. Hand jobs don't work. We need real decisive and incisive diplomatic initiative, and we're not showing very much at the moment.